Good morning, everybody. We'll get started in just a second as folks are coming in. Okay, finally some sunshine in Pensacola. I was getting all these, it's rainy today in Tennessee and in Kentucky, so it's good to know that there in Pensacola it's sunny. And I bet it's crowded too, because I know a lot of our folks from here in Kentucky are down there and enjoying their vacation. All right, we'll get started. We still got folks coming in, but it's a couple minutes after our start time. Thank you all. It's good to see you. I'm Dreama Gentry, Executive Director of Partners for Education. Excited to be with you for this conversation for action around college access and success. And actually, I was thinking back to, I think it was this time last year that we did our first webinar, our first conversation for action. And we actually had Andrew Moe, and who is I think he's at Swarthmore, but he's part of the Rural Special Interest Group with us, along with Luke Hodson, who's the Director of Admissions at Berea College. And that conversation was around how do we keep doing college access and success in this in that time, that emerging pandemic. And so it's a year later, we're still here, we're still doing the work. And the two guests I have with me today are active and leaders within the Rural SIG. So I'm joined today joining me today, can't talk this morning, guys, is Dr. Victoria Lewis, Director of University of Alabama Early College. And Victoria, good morning. Just say something so people can see you, and I know you're here.
Good morning, Dreama. Nice to meet you all. Thank you all for joining us today.
Great, thank you, thank you. And also joining me is Matt Ybarra, Associate Director of College Counseling for Santa Fe's Preparatory School. Matt, are you with us too?
Yes, I am. Thank you for having us.
All right, great. Thank you, guys. When I started thinking about the conversation for this month, I thought, okay, let's go back to the Rural SIG, right? So the Rural Special Interest Group is one of the most powerful networks of college access and success folks that I know. And I know over this last year, you guys have met this situation with the pandemic head on, and you've also really thought intentionally about your organization and how this organization can really serve all rural kids. So to start the conversation, tell us a little bit about yourselves and really how you have entered into both rural work and the Rural SIG. And Victoria, I'll start with you, and then Matt, I'll ask you after Victoria finishes.
Thank you, Dreama. As I mentioned, I'm Victoria Lewis. I currently serve as the Director of UA Early College at the University of Alabama. Was born and raised actually about 45 minutes outside of Tuscaloosa County in a rural county called Pickens County here, which is in the West Alabama area. And not only was raised in a rural county, but had an opportunity to go into K-12 education. My career started as a high school English teacher in a K-12 school. We had about 400 students, kindergarten through 12th grade. And I realized very quickly, not only as a teacher, but as I sort of moved into more of the instructional setting, I had a really difficult time trying to find a lot of resources for my students. I know our high school counselor within our school, we had one for the entire school. Had a difficult time trying to find resources, post-secondary resources specifically for our students, the best things for our students, et cetera, and trying to find that and trying to locate that as well. And that really sort of geared my passion for how can I best prepare our rural students? How can I find resources and access to help our teachers in our school setting, our counselors as well? And although I'm no longer in the K-12 setting, I'm now in the post-secondary setting, I'm in a really unique space because I work on the post-secondary side at the University of Alabama, but our students are high school students. So I am primarily working with high school students throughout the state of Alabama. About 63% of our student population are from what we would classify, or the state of Alabama would classify, as a rural county. And I have the opportunity to work with counselors throughout the state of Alabama, not just high school counselors, but also administrators as well. So I get to see both sides of how do I support our high school counselors, but then also really be able to add input and value on the recruitment end of how can recruitment and admissions professionals best support best support our rural students, our rural communities, and our rural families. I've been attending the NACAC conference for the last several years. This is the first time I've really gotten involved in advocacy and policy work with the rural and small town SIG, and certainly being able to serve in a leadership capacity has given me the opportunity to be able to broaden and really be able to provide a lot of feedback, seek feedback, and impact policy in ways I just haven't been able to do before. And so that is really what led me not only to the small town SIG, but also to the leadership aspect of that as well.
So one question, Victoria, just around NACAC, for folks who might not know what NACAC is.
Yes, I'm sorry. I never like to take for granted. I'm glad you mentioned that as well. But NACAC is sort of the broad national umbrella for admissions counselors and professionals. They host an annual conference each year, but they host a variety of other conferences throughout the year. The annual conference is usually held in September. It's not the only one. And within NACAC, there are several special interest groups, actually hundreds of special interest groups for every community, topic, or theme that you can think of. We are just involved in one of those. It's a great opportunity for you to get involved and for me to get involved because I work on the recruitment end, but also on the K-12 end.
Great. And what we'll do, and maybe Sam can put like the web link into NACAC and so that we have that in the chat for folks. And I knew, Victoria, we hadn't talked about it before. I figured you were from a rural place. So thanks for sharing that, because I've always interested in people's stories. And most of the folks I find that work in rural places or work in this area came from a rural place or somebody they loved it. So Matt, what about you? Tell us a little bit about your journey and how you got engaged in this rural work.
Yeah, that's no different from me. I'm from a small town called Altamont, Kansas. It's got about 1,000 people, sits on a highway, and no stoplights. So I went to a school that predominantly sent students to the local, state institutions. It was a big win for the school when we would send students to the flagship KU, or we had a very strong ag program. And so, K-State was a big draw there as well. But my older brother got the chance to do a summer program. And because I had the luxury of an older brother, I found out about summer programs and things. And that really opened my eyes to not just, being around other college going students that were thinking about education outside of a local 45-minute radius, but also really highlighted how much more opportunity there was. We had never left the country before. My high school may have had a student that applied to Arizona, my older brother's class. Outside of that, and like nobody else had gone west of Colorado. And so I actually was very fortunate. One of the top criteria when I was looking for colleges was that I needed to be able to see the stars, because I did a summer program in Boston. It made me really depressed. And so I ended up at a place called Stanford University that is very wide and open, lots of green space and things. And so I started going to classes and really acknowledged the fact that I had really talented high school peers that didn't pursue the college route as I did. And that I knew that there was a lot of talent there. Fast forward to graduation, thinking about like what I want to do as a job, and I got a job in the admission office, and I worked for 7 years in highly selective admission across Stanford and Caltech. But getting the chance to go to like the National Hispanic Scholars College Fairs and things like that in Fresno, in the Central Valley, getting to know students from migrant communities and other populations that are not necessarily kind of the target destination for college recruitment in big cities and other things like that. I also participated in a program called College Horizons, which is really advocating and opening doors for Native American, Indigenous youth around the country, and introducing them to a lot of colleges they've never heard of or don't have a footprint in their local communities, especially if they come from tribal communities. And after those 7 years, ended up working as a college counselor here in Santa Fe at an independent high school. But Santa Fe and New Mexico at large is largely rural, and lots of small town communities, a lot of like long-term historical legacy, heritage, and other things, both with Pueblo communities in the Navajo Nation and also long-standing Hispanic communities as well. So one of the things that drew me to the SIG and the leadership board was really this call out for more of an inclusive understanding of how communities change and what different demographics exist for rural communities around the country. You know, I came from a largely white population where I grew up. Now I'm in a state where 85% of the rural students identify coming from communities of color, and also 85% of our rural students would be Pell eligible. And thinking about that in terms of driving the conversation toward college access and recruitment, the way that admission officers think about diversifying their class, and also just seeing this explosion on college campuses for first generation resource centers, and really targeting more of a socioeconomic diversity on their campus, and wanting more representation, while thinking also about really the strength and texture that rural students add, coming from different parts of the country. I mean, it's nice to see those graphs on college brochures that we've got a student from every state, or we've got representation from 45, but if they always come from the same high school in that one state, you're not really diversifying the population as much. And thinking about those discussions that happen on campus, and also just how our populations are becoming more urban centered. We don't want rural populations to be left out of those conversations. So really excited to see more colleges take a bite at that apple. Currently, I work, like I said, in independent school, but we're very lucky. We have a college access program called Breakthrough Santa Fe, the Breakthrough Collaborative network across the country. We are the host site for that, but because of that, and because of its success over time, there was a scholarship that developed out of it called the Davis, New Mexico Scholarship, which really opens doors as a cost of attendance scholarship for first generation low income students from northern New Mexico. Primarily that had been dedicated for Santa Fe and Albuquerque students that were tied to college access programs. And we really saw that as an omission for rural students. If you came from one of these smaller communities around northern New Mexico, you didn't have access to that amazing scholarship, because it meets not only the full need, but also covers travel and like parent travel to the campus, and allows students to not take out loans and other pieces. So it's a really an amazing scholarship. I think I'm maybe correct that it might be the largest also scholarship for undocumented students in the country as well. But because of that this year, and largely because of our ability to tap into virtual resources and outreach, even during the pandemic, to schools that were trying to make it work online, like so many of us around the country, we were able to start this program called ROCA New Mexico, which stands for Rural Opportunities for College Access. And that gives those students from rural backgrounds a pathway to that scholarship. But we're very much more excited about the opportunities to get a foothold into a lot of these local and rural high schools around the state that don't have dedicated college counseling resources. And I think that struggle certainly goes back to my time as a high school student. I wrote my own college profile because our high school didn't have one. And being able to work with a SIG and an organization that has created a lot of those free resources for rural counselors and educators. It's not always the counselor. Sometimes it's a high school, history or English teacher that's really the driver toward college going culture on those campuses. So really excited about what kind of outreach that's going to develop in time.
And it would be great, Matt, if you could drop into the chat the link to Breakthrough. Is it Breakthrough? Because I do think they do national work, and also your state organization, because I think that what you're doing there is great. And then I'm going off script a little bit here, Victoria, but you mentioned the policy and advocacy piece, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. Matt talked a lot about getting kids into college. But does the Rural SIG also think about the success and how you all work to ensure that once they're in these colleges and universities, they're supported? So can you speak a little to that? And if you can't, that's fine, because I know I just didn't prepare you for this question.
No, no worries. Thank you for asking that, Dreama. We have actually talked about that quite a bit. So that the leadership team and the SIG is not just focusing specifically on the admissions and enrollment piece, because oftentimes we're doing college spotlights. We have resources. There are lots of things posted on the YouTube channel. We're talking about summer programs, et cetera. But there's a retention aspect to that as well. It's not enough to enroll the students. We also have a responsibility that once we enroll them, that we try to make sure as much as we can, we ensure their success. So one of the things that we are hoping to do is to be able to grow resources and professional development as it relates to retention. We've worked a lot with college admissions professionals, but I don't know that we have done a lot of partnerships and collaborations, or if there have been a lot of conversations with a lot of our retention folks and a lot of our student affairs people that are out there. And so I think there are opportunities for the SIG to continue to pursue that. I know these are conversations we are having right now on the leadership team, and I think that that outreach will continue to grow as far as it relates to retention once they're enrolled at the post-secondary level.
Yeah, I
So
think
Matt,
to add on to
Matt,
that, just
yeah,
I would say that we have talked a lot about and are looking forward to different opportunities to help train admission officers to look for what really rural students adds to their campus and how to best navigate that recruitment, because it's not as simple as setting up a high school visit. Sometimes those are, hour and a half away from where their next engagement might be. Taking advantage of virtual opportunities as well, but also really an emerging opportunity and initiative that it looks like is going to happen over the next year is outreach to colleges that have rural resource centers dedicated right now, and which ones are doing well, to potentially build a playbook for colleges that want to develop that kind of resource but don't really know where to start, or want to do it by bypassing a lot of the growing pains that some of these organizations have done and gone through in addition. So we were just on a call yesterday talking about where that might go in the future.
And Matt, you've sent rural students, or you've supported rural students as they went to colleges. So when you're helping them think about fit, so most of the folks listening today, a lot of them will be folks that are helping rural students get into colleges. And we want to know that when they're there, they're going to be supported. So what should a college access professional be looking for when they're helping a young person navigate choice, especially when they're thinking of those schools out of state that they may not know as well?
Right. I get frustrated personally when my conversations about college start about major, because as I tell my students, we're in a high school and you're very limited in choice. We regiment that you have to take English, you have to take math, science, foreign language, history, and you don't get a lot of depth in terms of, do you work at a high school that offers sociology or psychology or anthropology? And very few of them, very few professionals work at high schools that offer all three, right? And thinking about different pathways toward, the larger liberal arts conversation, thinking about, do students actually get fully engaged and understand the differences and nuances between different engineering fields or whatever. So it's largely trying to talk them into what is the experience that you want to have and what kind of place is going to hold you, become your own new community. For me to go to a place from 1,000 people in my town to 15,000 students in the third largest campus in the world, that was a shock. And I know that a lot of students go through that similar transition and shock when they go from a rural place to an urban college, and to a place that has like public transportation. And maybe this is the first flight that the students got on. The large number of study abroad programs typically drop students in cities in foreign countries. That's another element on that makes it a little bit more, anxious, maybe frustrating, certainly a growing curve. And so thinking about who are going to be the important people on the campus that shape that student's experience. A lot of colleges might tip that to the advisor, but it could be, a particular community group. It could be, a college, a student organization. I really push my students toward volunteer work so that they understand that it's not just the college campus, but also the outside community that they're, trying to join, those kinds of things. For me, the second home for me really were, at Stanford, we have things called ethnic theme dorms where you could live in a population of predominant specific demographics. So you could live in a 50% Asian or Asian American themed dorm and be part of that larger majority if you'd never gotten the chance, or live as a minority within that context. And so I lived 2 years in the African American themed dorm, and I had roommates from 5 different international African countries, as well as students from 3 different geographic regions within the United States, and all of them explaining and sharing with me what the Black experience, that diaspora has been, and for all of them. That was wildly different and incredibly eye-opening, and really drove me to think about how much learning actually happens at college that is not technically defined on a class and doesn't get printed on your transcript. And so a lot of the conversations I really try and have with students thinking about, is this going to be the place that I land and call home? How am I going to be supported? How do I want to challenge myself, stretch my limits, expose myself to something new? Certainly, that's what college is all about, in my opinion. But at the same time, finding places where you can get tutoring. Where is the writing center? Is there a financial aid officer that you trust, that is on your side, right? And having the ability, like having worked in college admission, I understand, like, we now live in an email world, and all those professionals are just begging for a phone call because they want that personal connection. And this year is even worse, right? I know so many admission officers, they're like, I'm thinking about quitting the job because part of the perk, what I really wanted to do was the travel and to meet all these different people to create that network. And so there is an admission officer on any college campus that isn't concerned with retention. There may be, barriers between that work, but that's certainly something that I look forward to when building those relationships with admission officers. Like, who are the people that I want to transition my kids to, that I know that are going to be in careful hands?
Yeah, and I think that's it, right? It's you're handing the baton off, and you're making sure. So Victoria, any thoughts from your years of working in that K-12 piece of what folks should be looking for? Because I know my kid is going into his senior year, and honestly, sometimes the admissions officers, they're trying to make their numbers. I feel that, right? And especially with my kid being a high-performing kid, and they're like, okay, but how do I cut through that and find like the real person who really is thinking about the retention piece? And I love my admissions officers, right? But do you know what I'm asking here, Victoria?
Absolutely. And I see both sides of that because I work on the recruitment end, but I also am trying to look out for the best interests of our high school students. So I'll speak from both aspects of that. Thinking of having, high school seniors, I'll reiterate what Matt sort of said. We stress, especially with our early college students, the first thing you need to look for when you're speaking with admissions counselors, when you're visiting college campuses, we tell our parents and guardians this as well, if we're having community meetings, is you really need to think about what type of support you need. What is by far the highest level of priority for you in terms of support? Is it a community space? Is it that you need more academic support? Is it that you need to find different areas, et cetera, with your niche? Is what would you classify as sort of the highest level of support? And start your search from there. I completely agree with what Matt mentioned, that we also discourage students from solely considering institutions based on majors. Oftentimes they don't know, and what you think you know really isn't what you think you know. So we really try to encourage them to really think about the entire picture, sort of wade through some of the information that on the recruitment side, we're probably focusing a little bit more on is the selling of the majors to sort of pull you in, but to also focus more on the support side. So we tell our students, ask questions about the retention piece. How will I be supported academically? Do you have student success coaches if that's what I need? What academic resources are out there? What communities are out there if that's what I need? If I'm thinking about a large institution, but I'm from a rural town, how do I make that large institution small? So are there clubs? Are there organizations? Is it easy to join those clubs and organizations? How do I find my specific niche? I know a lot of our students, because they do reside in rural towns, and we have a lot of large public institutions. The University of Alabama has 42,000 students. And when you think about that large population of students on our college campus, and we are primarily serving students from towns that may have 2,000 and 3,000 people, coming to the University of Alabama can be incredibly intimidating in itself. So how do you find your best niche, your best fit, your best experience and start there. And we also, Dreama, tell our students, and I would encourage, especially for families, and this is something we have tried to work on our end on the recruitment piece with early college, is doing a better job of having community meetings to engage and inform parents and guardians. Because what we have found, this is just as much of an overwhelming process for them, especially in rural communities, as it is for students. They are just as overwhelmed by the entire process of not understanding the lingo, not necessarily knowing what they should be looking for to best support their students. So how do we do a better job of making this just a little bit clearer for them? How do we help inform them of best practices as far as questions? So how do we teach them some of the questions you want to be asking admissions counselors and professionals and those on the enrollment side when trying to determine the best fit and the best niche for your students? So it kind of works hand in hand.
Yeah, and I feel that right now. Like I said, my son's just finished his junior year, and I'm a professional. I do this for a living, but I'm paralyzed, right? And I think about so many parents themselves didn't go to college, right? And so if I'm feeling this way, so you're right. And I think that's something that we need to dig into in a future conversation, is how do we really reach parents where they are and help them have this expansive view of post-secondary to where they're really thinking about fit, right? And where is the college fit? Which leads me into my next question. And I think when I first learned about the rural SIG, and I was looking at the resources, and this is right when it first evolved, it really did seem that it was focused on those students that might be our high achievers, that might be thinking of this, of going to schools away from here, right? But I feel like that there's some change there and some movement. So does one of you all want to sort of frame that? Because the folks that are listening today, we're working with kids that we're trying to get out of high school. We're working with kids that we're trying to get into college. We also have some high achievers that we should be reaching higher for. So how is the SIG thinking about that complexity of rural students of all levels?
Yeah, I'll touch on that. I'd like to go back just a second because I haven't gotten the chance, and I've been dropping a few links in the chat. So I appreciate all of you that have been keeping up with me. But another way to get to know institutions is we've asked some colleges to do recorded information sessions on this YouTube channel directed at rural students so that they can highlight some of the resources and people that exist on the campus to help ease that transition. I also really appreciated what Rebecca posted in the chat about NC State doing a dedicated orientation for rural students and families. And I really would encourage so many more colleges to host that kind of thing, but also not be turned off entirely when when those events might not have the largest draw. If you put them with in competition with other communities or demographics, because there is such an intersectionality. Dreama just mentioned how large the population of rural students is, also first generation, and that may have been a driver or more of a hot topic that there's more resource built around. But personally, from my experience, there was just a lot of crossover as to where I could get those resources and people that I could trust. So I'm going to put that link in the chat for the YouTube playlist anyway. In terms of what we do, I think that the SIG, first and foremost, really is a design for what are free resources that are available to all counselors that would be helpful for all students. And that can be, yes, talking about like fly-ins for more, coveted students or students that are going to hit kind of the top demographics in terms of like what colleges are looking for and maybe targeting their admission recruitment on. But it can also, and what we're doing with ROCA is really focusing on building out the relationship with high schools, thinking about how is talking about out-of-state college a benefit so that we know what resources are out there and that students have explored what those possibilities might mean, knowing full well that we have some outstanding in-state institutions that might feel more familiar and comfortable. We just want you to consider both options and to understand really what all options are. So yes, that conversation certainly builds toward maybe more of a schools with national profiles or larger endowments or other things for those top 10% students that exist in those graduating classes. But it's also something that other students need to be aware of. And so one of the pushes I think for this next year is to think about it a little bit more regionally. This might happen because we're developing more of a state captain model. And so there will be more communication directed toward each of the 50 states, here in the US, about what happens regionally, which institutions have programs and partnerships and other things, but also thinking about like what are local out-of-state tuition reciprocation agreements or other things that they might do, and thinking about how even those institutions that are not necessarily in the news all the time, but are across the state border and only an hour and a half or two away, maybe that's far enough, but not too far for a student, right? And thinking about like how other states' public education systems might benefit them as well. So those are pieces that we're working on. I think it's currently in the development of it, but we've also done these things called learning labs. And so I posted a chat to one of those before. Oh, I'm sorry. One of the,
Yeah, I just told folks that we
Yeah.
would get all the
we'll put it
pieces
back
to
in.
them. So
But no, like the learning labs, some of them have focused on how do I write a better recommendation letter,
Yep.
especially if I haven't written recommendation letters in the past. I've mentioned school profiles before. If you're a school that doesn't have one, how do I develop one? Or how do I make one better because I haven't looked at it in 20 years, right? Those kinds of things I think are really critical. And so putting out building blocks, working with some different, also college access partners or other things. That's actually how I met Victoria really through the SIG, is trying to get to know a little bit more about virtual resources for college counseling, students that want to go to college but don't have that dedicated resource in their high school. And so that has been really nice. There isn't a website currently, which I think we're all very frustrated with. But right now, the listserv is the best resource that we can have. And also getting to know who the point person is, maybe locally in your region. I mean, even before I got involved with the SIG, I was sending around like, hey, I saw this on a listserv. This is a free resource. There's a new talk coming out next week. Have you thought about this, program or a scholarship that you might not have heard of that also pertains to your area? Just with local, word of mouth. It was fairly informal. And the SIG is just a national branch of that, in my opinion. So it's really an opportunity to think about how can I become a better counselor or educator or supporter of students? And if I know about it, there's always a kid that pops in your mind. Maybe not immediately, but that stores in the back. I'm like, wait a second, I know that was the thing. Let's go back through my search history and in my email.
And I think what it reminds us, as those of us doing, like my work started with Upper Bound and Trio and then went into Gear Up, is that when we're doing that, we're really serving all students, right? Especially with Gear Up. And so it's important that we have strategies and partners that can serve every student and take them to the next step. And so this is just another tool in the toolbox. One of the reasons we started this national network and thinking about rural college access was we also realized we needed to start thinking about moving policy at the federal level, at the state level, to really ensure that there were resources and support and strategies to ensure that rural kids succeeded. So Victoria, I know the policy is something you're really interested in. So tell us a little bit about what the Rural SIG is thinking around the policy aspect.
Yes, we actually have 3 different sort of branches on the leadership team as it relates to what we're focusing on. And one of those areas is, of course, advocacy and policy. Matt and I have the privilege of being able to work in sort of this advocacy and policy subgroup. And there are about 7 of us who are really interested in how do we move forward the needle as it relates to policy, focusing on rural students and rural communities, beginning with our own umbrella with NACAC. How do we have conversations with the overall leadership team of NACAC to really focus on really bringing professionals together, focusing on the mission and the purpose of advancing access, resources, and opportunities for students and families in rural communities. And so that has to start with what's working. How do we define rural? I think we're still having conversations about that on the leadership team because we come from various areas throughout the country. How we're all defining rural, we're seeing is very different. as well. So to really be able to have those conversations in order to be able to move forward and realize that it's okay that's going to look different in a variety of different areas. How do we involve our post-secondary professionals in these conversations along with our K-12 professionals in these conversations as well? And I think what's been most important for me on the policy and advocacy side is seeking the feedback from those within the SIG about, one, how do we best support your efforts and your needs, but then also how do we take that feedback that we're receiving from the SIG to be able to develop and create and move forward with policy and with action, and to advocate for their needs and also for the needs of the various communities that are represented within our SIG. So, as I mentioned earlier, this has given me the opportunity, not just on the SIG, to be able to have a chance. It's to be able to discuss policy with other professionals who have the same interests that I do as it relates to rural students in rural communities, which is not something that I had earlier, especially when I was working in K-12 and was seeking that community to be able to do that and didn't have that ability to be able to do that. But we are seeking feedback from various members of our SIG, having conversations about rural, how do we find ways to impact policy at the NACAC level and then move beyond there.
And that sounds great. And I realized that, we didn't really talk about what it means to be a SIG member. And I joined after that first conversation with Andrew because I was like, wow, this is out here and I didn't know this. So Matt, you want to just sort of say like how many members you have, how people could join, what the cost is? So give us just sort of the summary of that piece.
Yeah, well, I'll start with the exciting part. The cost is zero.
Right.
Only your time, really. And that, kind of points to what Victoria was talking about also. Like, it's an invitation for you to become your own advocate and an advocate in your own community, an advocate for schools that might not have you on their map yet. Thinking about how you can build out partnerships with other local, resources and other things as well. We have over 1,800 members, but one of the other pieces that I should highlight is over 600 of them are school counselors, and the vast majority of them are public school counselors that have no affiliation with NACAC, the larger umbrella, or with their, individual regional representation. Ours is called RAMACAC. There's too many ACACs, but ours is Rocky Mountain Associated College Admission Counselors, right? But thinking about that, as well as putting you on the same kind of conversation line as researchers, as grad students. We've seen a number of people put out, polls or surveys that are going to help them publish their research. CBO advisors, community-based organizations, people that work with nonprofits, and building off of the strengths of other people. I see this in different Facebook groups or other social media opportunities as well. But this is one that I think is really interesting because it's dedicated specifically, and it all comes from I think a really positive point in their heart, where it's, I did this thing and I want to share it with you, or does anybody have questions about this? What would be really beneficial? And a lot of the ideas that have come to the leadership board have been ones that have been offered up by people that have never really been to a national conference in that space, or had that particular college admission training necessarily. And they're just putting out a feeler like, this would be helpful. Oh yeah, that's something that we could put and dedicate resources and people to lead. So thinking about that, I think is really beneficial. Plus, the admission officers have an ear to the ground directly with counselors that they usually don't take the time to reach out to directly. Right. And I think that's really critical. I've been very impressed and grown a lot personally, having gone through highly selective admission. I knew a lot more about private institutions, but public institutions not in my state, I was very unaware of in so many cases. And to understand a little bit more about what efforts that are going on in Colorado or in Michigan or Georgia, that's been really inspiring to see. Maybe that's something I could nudge the needle with here in New Mexico, or thinking about my own region in that way.
And we'll put the link to the SIG on there, so folks, if they want to join. Matina had a question around really bringing up and reminding us that college choice really also has to engage the financial situation, the readiness to be self-managed, and that students have to understand the budgeting and costs. And I would add, from my own perspective, that parents need to also understand that. So Victoria, as the SIG looks at this, is there financial aid people also engaged, or is there discussions within the SIG piece around that, because college fit is more than just does the student fit, but can the student afford to fit?
Yes, one of the things we're actually working on is hosting a series of virtual workshops, inviting in sort of those who work around financial aid to talk about best practices. How can we engage families and communities in rural areas? We recognize that there are some states and some communities that are doing a really good job of not only informing rural communities and students, et cetera, but also doing a really good job of sharing resources and information across the span. So how do we see what they're doing, what's working even within our own leadership team? We realized that different states have different initiatives that I don't think realized were out there, that were available, and how can we pull from what maybe some other states are doing to help our own communities inform what we're doing. So yes, we are planning on hosting some workshops for those within our SIG or those outside of it, because you don't have to be a member of the SIG to attend anything that we host. So you can just invite someone as it relates to financial aid, and how do we bring that information about financial aid and financial aid professionals into the conversation as it relates to rural students. So yes, we've had conversations about that.
And I think
I've learned about, just a couple scholarships nationally that have been available for other students that I work with on the side that I had not known about because of the SIG and the listserv. When they're talking about, there was even one that was like, we're developing a scholarship. What should we ask for in the application? And we got the chance as, high school counselors to give feedback to an organization that was going to give, initially money to our students. So that was really neat.
And I think back to one of my first interactions was the fly-in programs, right? And the fly-in programs for rural students where the cost was covered. And it was really interesting there. And I think as college access professionals, we have to sort of challenge ourselves, because I was in a room with folks and we were talking about that. And there was this piece of, well, that's not really for our students to do those fly-ins. And I'm like, yes, it is, right? Even if our students are low income, first generation, we can't be putting caps on them, right? We have to be thinking of the possibilities. And that's the piece that I've enjoyed from being part of the group, is that the people in the group are thinking about possibilities for rural students that's unlimited, which is really exciting.
Yeah, I had the great fortune of and really amazing response to host a virtual college fair for myself and another high school here in New Mexico. We had 70 colleges that showed up to that. But one of the things that I asked for on the registration was whether or not those colleges were actually aggressively targeting rural students in their recruitment, and about half had. And so thinking about how that fly-in list that was developed, that's currently on my plate, it's going to come out later this summer, hopefully. It's also a bit dependent on question marks at a lot of colleges around the COVID and how they reopened to outside visitors. But to see how that started, and then I think really resulted in pressure to other institutions to say, is this a population that we really need to be more hungry with and to be more cognizant of? Are we happy with the way that those programs for different demographics and target populations have gone? Is this one that we want to make space for? And I think colleges have seen, again, that intersectionality and the excitement around that, but also really seeing that, like, oh, this is another area that we feel like we're underpopulated in our college campus, and something that I remember when there was a push at Caltech. We were working for more first generation students as part of that population. And the immediate question mark was, well, which of our faculty members are first generation students? And it was surprising to see how many professors at Caltech were and were very interested. They had not been so interested in working with admission or recruitment before, but the moment we said, hey, there's a kid like you out there, can you help them navigate what this process is? Would you want to be the advisor, right? They were so eager. And to see that kind of develop on other college campuses, particularly around this issue, as you see, from Victoria and myself, if you come from a background like this, you're far more personally invested in trying to see students follow in the footsteps and maybe, go in different directions that you wish that you hadn't stumbled over too. So I think this is, something that unites, I think, a lot of people on that listserv, if they come from rural backgrounds, certainly, but if they don't, understanding this is a really sensitive area that is also one that, like, changes based on different regions. as
Yeah.
well. So it has a different layer of nuance than some of these other programs.
And I'm excited to see your emerging work as you start to think about which institutions across the country have centers or support networks for rural students, because hopefully we'll see financial and scholarships emerging in those too, which also might mitigate some of the concern around the financial piece. We have another question, and folks, if you have questions, we have a couple minutes for questions, so drop them in the chat. This one is really, have you seen any research, case studies regarding the retention of rural students connected or correlated to mental health needs and healthcare services available on a campus? And I know that with the pandemic, we're all thinking about that, right? Anything or any emerging things around that you could share? And it's okay to say no.
Off the top of my head, I do know that the college conversation toward mental health has been, I don't know, an emerging factor over at least the last 5 years that really have seen more interest. I was in a closed meeting in a room with a very well-known school that was so excited that they had just hired their third mental health counselor to meet with the demand. But we also met with a counselor in that same meeting that said, yeah, my kid has been trying to sign up for that initial mental health meeting for a couple months now.
Yeah.
And, you know, there's still that disconnect of what resource exists on the campus and what the students are needing. And coming out of the pandemic, that need is going to be even greater. I think that's no surprise to anyone. And certainly for the counselors that are on this call right now, like that's what you're thinking about for next year as well, what that transition back into, in-person school and other things have been. That's certainly on my mind. But at the same time, I don't think I've seen it disaggregated necessarily for studies directly toward rural students. I think it's been largely more directed toward maybe first generation students and what those, unexpected hurdles maybe they encounter or other pieces. Also just around like racial lines and microaggressions that exist on campuses when they leave a pocket or maybe a larger concentration of their own demographic to go to a predominantly white institution. That's another piece toward mental health that I've seen develop a little bit more, but not necessarily directed at rural students.
And I think it makes me think that this idea around what are colleges and universities doing around the mental health piece is probably a great future conversation. And it goes back to what both of you shared is as we're guiding those students and helping them to make decisions in the families, the mental health counselor and the mental health support network on the campus may be something that they need to really think and ask those questions about. Whereas 5 years ago, we may not have thought about asking those questions. I also feel like there's an added element around learning differences there as well. And if students are getting accommodations in high school, knowing how to seek out those resources in college, if they haven't gotten them but really needed them in high school, that college might be another open opportunity for that to explore as well. Yeah, that's a great topic. I hadn't thought about. See, I'm coming up with all these great topics. That's why you guys having this broad overview piece. So we're down to our last few minutes. Anything specific you guys want to add before I go into some closing and talk about what's coming up?
I just want to reiterate that the rural and small town SIG is really open to anyone. As Matt mentioned, we're one of the very few NACAC SIGs. We don't have a cost associated with it. We're not looking to add one, but really just looking for feedback and to gather together a community of professionals for those who are interested in furthering the conversation around rural communities. So we would love for you to either join the listserv, engage in the conversation, share feedback with the leadership team as well on ways that we can better support you, better support your students, and better support your rural communities. I always seek feedback. So we are seeking that feedback. We serve on a leadership team to support the SIG. And what we're doing in all of our activities and our work should be to support the SIG and support our rural community. So we seek your feedback.
Great. Thank you, Victoria. Matt?
Just in terms of open sharing and open source, like I've met a lot of really interesting colleagues through the year, particularly as we've done more outreach around our specific, statewide college access program, but also understanding just like how much goodwill and good centeredness is out there, and also how blind some people that have been working in this field for some time are to a lot of different resources that I may have just been introduced to, and understanding like, oh, that's something I should pass along. So really just stressing that, like, if you're trying to do the work and you've been doing the work, you're not alone, but that you may be stronger together. And not just to reiterate also that it's free, but you also are not required in any way to maintain or start a membership with one of these national organizations either. That also can come with a cost. And we know that, not every budget allows for that. And so seeing how this has kind of gone grassroots and developed in that way, and will continue to grow based on that kind of a need, and also the sense that every person that is on that listserv benefits from it in some different ways. So.
Great, thank you. And someone had asked the question, is there a fly-in list for rural students? There is, and I'm sure that would probably be at one of those links that you sent.
It'll be updated. It's a certainly pre-pandemic, and so we need the post-pandemic one. That'll happen largely, I think, late July, early August is my target to send it out. I also really want to encourage, if this has been inspiring or exciting for you, you want to be involved more or connect more with colleagues around your state or local region. I'm putting my email in the chat, but I would love to hear from you if you're interested in becoming like a state captain or part of that, kind of larger organization as we start to build out more enthusiasm in your region. That would be awesome to be able to hear from you directly.
Wonderful. And we put I think Matt put his email address in there. Victoria, if you'd like to do yours, include that also. So thank you guys. This has been inspiring. And looking ahead to our Rural Summit, which we're planning to be in person next April. And Sam just put the information, April 24th through the 26th in Scottsdale, Arizona. What we had planned for last year, the one we had to cancel, was a partnership with the Rural SIG that included a college fair out by the pool. I think we were actually looking, or out by the area around the pool, where colleges and universities that really do have a specific interest in rural students would come and have a chance to meet college access professionals and college success professionals. So we're hoping we're going to be looping back with the Rural SIG folks. We're hoping that something like that could happen next year at the Arizona Summit. And because I do think that getting to know and forming the partnerships with the individual admissions counselors at these institutions that are committed to rural is key. And it reminds us that our kids, the world is their option, right? And so we can't just have the partnerships in the local area. We have to have partnerships across the country. So that is sort of where we are. Thank you guys so much. We'll be back together in July. And honestly, I don't have a topic yet for the July one. So you gave me lots of suggestions. So the folks that tune in every month to these, we'll be sending out the invites and the topics fairly soon. So thank you, Matt. Thank you, Victoria. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye, guys.